Good evening. Tonight I want to read you a story from a book I wrote for my grandkids. These are a bunch of short stories I put together from things that's happened in my life. And tonight I want to read you a story about the summer I was 16. I worked as a cook in my aunt's restaurant, and she came to me with the complaint that she could find no one to open in the mornings and was wearing down doing it herself. I agreed to open the doors at 6 a.m. and work until 11, 4 days a week, and she would pay me 75 cents an hour, 10 cents more than any of her other cooks were getting. Opening the door at 6 a.m. meant I had to have coffee ready and the grill hot by then, as workmen often waited at the door for breakfast. They came in and ordered as soon as the door was open. A waitress came in later in the morning to help finish up with the breakfast customers and start washing dishes. There would be the regular customers who usually ordered the same thing every morning. And there was toast and French toast, pancakes, eggs, omelets, bacon, ham and sausage, and pretty standard breakfast fare. An occasional passer through might order hot or cold cereal or some fruit. People are mostly quiet that early in the day, and a conversation with a regular would run something like this. Morning. Morning. Breakfast? Yep, usual. Coffee? Yep. I would get a cup and I'd fill it with coffee and place it beside them. They'd grab a newspaper and bury their face or just stare at nothing until I brought them their breakfast. Some people would continue reading the papers they ate. I'd check every few minutes to see if they needed anything and keep their coffee cup filled. My routine, besides fielding the incoming customers, was to prepare the food necessary for the noon meal, as well as make pies for the day. I also made chili most every day and soup of the day. These were served all day, every day, alone or with a sandwich, by the cup or the bowl. And I checked on the roast pork and roast beef and started a new roast as that was needed. And hot roast pork and hot roast beef were popular every day. My aunt worked the end of the day and always had refrigerator rolls for me to stick in the oven first thing in the morning. A special of the day, from meatloaf to turkey, I got ready to be hot and fresh at 11 a.m. That was the beginning of the noon hour. I particularly enjoyed making pies. Once the waitress arrived, I could be more involved in the kitchen. I didn't have to deal with the customers as much. I'd been making pies for years, but sometimes had trouble with my crust splitting when I rolled it out. My aunt showed me the simple solution. Roll from the middle to the edges. It's so simple, and it works. I'd make about 6 pies every day. I kept the oven busy and had to plan ahead to accomplish all I needed to. At 11 a.m. my aunt arrived with another cook or waitress and I went home. A side interest in the restaurant at that time was cigarette smoking and gum chewing. Actually, in any public place, grocery store, hardware, restaurant, bus station, etc. When people finished their cigarette, they threw it on the floor and just smashed it out with their foot. Pretty crude by today's standards. But the most interesting was the chewing gum decor. Gum was a penny a stick, and most people chewed it. My favorite flavors were juicy fruit and blackjack. There was spearmint, and double mint, and Beeman's, Dentine, and all the different brands of bubble gum. I particularly remember sour grapes, which flavor puckered your mouth and makes my mouth water thinking about it. Many of the different gums were different colors, adding to the decor. To see the artwork of the many, you had to kneel on the floor and look up to the bottom of each table or the entire underside of the counter, and flip up any chair bottom in the skill of blind searching fingers to stick their favorite worn out brand in just the right place was, well, disgusting. And if for any reason your fingers slid under one of the mentioned surfaces, it came into immediate contact with humps, bumps, and globs, sometimes 2 and 3 deep. It was one of the waitress's jobs to scrape this accumulation off occasionally. And the artists seemed to take this as a great compliment and apparently multiplied their efforts to recover the affected surface. You know what sugar ants are? Those tiny little red ants that once in your house can find anything sweet. There isn't much you can do about them. Oh, there's sprays and bombs now. Not then. All you could do was try to keep stuff cleaned up and locked up. One morning I was making pies. My first pie was an apple pie. I'd put the bottom crust into the pan and dump the freshly sliced apples to fill it up to overflowing. I scooped a heaping cup of sugar out of the sack and dumped it on top of the apples, and the sugar ran down into the gaps between the apple slices. And there, scurrying in their usual frantic state, were a half dozen of these little sugar ants. I made a stabbing pinch with the thumb and forefinger. I might have got one. As I lifted my hand, I saw a couple ants slither down into the depths of the apples. I tried to find them. It was no good. In the moment, there was no trace of the ants. I looked around to see if anyone was watching. Not a soul, and I spooned some flour over the guts of the pie and sprinkled some cinnamon over that. Picking up the top crust that was laying ready, I covered the little buggers carefully and pinched the two crusts together. The oven was hot. Tough luck, guys. Nobody complained about the flavor. I had one episode of these little rascals. I had one other, I should say. On one morning before the waitress came to work, a stranger entered the restaurant, and I asked him if he wanted breakfast. But he just wanted pie and coffee. The pie cases were not refrigerated then, and the usual was for the pie to be placed in the refrigerator at the end of the day. The pie case was cleaned and all was well. In the morning, as someone had time, the pies were again placed in the pie case. Well, they forgot those details the night before. I didn't serve that much pie, and never thought that much of it when the man nodded toward the pie case and ordered a piece of apple pie a la mode. First, his coffee was delivered to him. Most people wanted their coffee right away. He took a sip, and grabbed a newspaper, and began reading with his full attention on the print before him. I removed a piece of the pie from the case and turned to the ice cream freezer, scooped up a large scoop of ice cream, and I set it in front of him. I was pretty busy in the back, and he showed no interest in anything but the paper. No one else was sitting at the counter. I'd glance out at him frequently and see him reach around the paper with his fork, and he'd cut off a bite of pie, and he'd place it in his mouth, and he'd chew, and maybe lift his cup to his lips. Never looked around. He never lost interest in his newspaper. Well, I thought it was time to check on his coffee. It was more than half empty. I filled his cup up. He never looked up from his paper. As I turned to set the pot back, I glanced at his half-eaten pie. He held a fork in his hand, ready to reach around the paper and braille off another bite. It was then I saw the flow of the ants crawling on his plate, on his pie, and in and out of his pie. There were more than dozens. There was scores of ants on his plate. Immediately wondered how many he had eaten. I tried to glance at his face and look at his eye, look him in the eye, but he was too involved in his paper. Now, had I noticed earlier that the pie case had been taken over by thousands of ants, and they had erected their nation's flag on the highest point of each pie, I'd have said something. Had I noticed the ants on his piece of pie before he ate some of it, I'd have said something. I decided that this nice man did not want to know about the ants now. It was just too late. So I went back to the kitchen, left him to his paper, his coffee, and his peaceful consumption of what was apparently an enjoyable piece of pie. After a while, my customer laid his paper down and he stood. I came to the counter. The pie was all gone. He handed me some money. I gave him his change, and he went on his way, another satisfied customer.